The Tower of Jericho, often known simply as the Watchtower, is one of the most extraordinary buildings in human history. Not because of its intricate architecture, but simply because of how old it is. Nothing on its scale or size is found again for thousands upon thousands of years. At around 30 feet in diameter and 28 feet tall, it's estimated to have taken around 11,000 days of labour to build the tower, and that doesn't include planning or the quarrying of resources. When Kenyon first uncovered the tower, it was thought to be the first example of communal architecture on the planet, built around 8000 BC, a time when the vast majority of humans still lived a nomadic, hunter-gatherer existence. Its architecture, including walls 5 feet thick and an interior staircase leading up to the roof, seemed to be completely unprecedented in both scale and design. A significant portion of labour in the community must have been dedicated to its construction, implying a highly organised and motivated society. But what was the purpose of the tower? The settlement it stood at the heart of, part of the culture we know today as the pre-pottery Neolithic A, thrived from around 8,500 to 7,370 BC. It isn't the only settlement in the region, similar sites existing at places such as Zad and Derar. Yet, with an area of around 425,000 feet, Jericho is by far the largest we know of. Researchers have come up with all sorts of conclusions as to the purpose of the tower. Perhaps it was a giant grain holder, a defence against external enemies, an early form of castle, or even all of the above. One of the most convincing arguments, however, and one which links back to the ceremonial site at Göbekli Tepe, is that the tower served a religious function. The religion of the pre-pottery Neolithic people is still heavily debated, and though we'll probably never know exactly how it worked, we can find parallels with other contemporary, earlier and later sites. Scholars such as Maria Gimbutas see a cult of the mother goddess holding sway over the Fertile Crescent, interpreted in sculptures and artwork all over the region, even arguing that this inspired the leap to agriculture. Yet this remains a controversial idea, and others argue for male animalistic deities, often depicted with phalluses on sites such as Göbekli Tepe. Perhaps the horns of wild cattle buried underneath houses at pre-pottery Neolithic Jericho could be related to this animal cult. The tower itself contains tantalizingly little evidence. There is no pottery here, no bones or burials underneath it, and it is not linked to the other fortifications or buildings at the site. Yet, what else but religion, the very worldview of these people, could have motivated a construction such as this? Perhaps the tower facilitated accurate observations of the sky, both stars and the sun, or even their worship, doubling up as an observatory and temple. We know that in later ages, shrines and sanctuaries of deities would often be built on raised platforms in order to get closer to the heavens. This happened throughout the Americas, and even in the Greek and Roman world, with augurs on the Capitoline Hill looking to the birds to find their destinies. This tradition even survived into early Christianity, with late classical aesthetics living atop giant pillars to commune with God. Could the tower at Jericho be an early example of this tradition? And if so, who exactly was doing the communing, taking on the role of intermediary between the community below and the gods above? At the similar but slightly later site of Çatalhöyük, priest kings are thought to have controlled city life, a tradition certainly utilized by later Sumerian cities such as Uruk and Eridu, places with extremely prominent sky gods in their religions. Perhaps here at Jericho, 10,000 years ago, shamanistic priest kings directed rituals from the top of the tower, being closer to the other world by doing so. A leftover that their cultural descendants would continue to utilize for 10 millennia to come. As far as most people were concerned, that was that. Jericho had the oldest tower on Earth. Then, in 1999, without even particularly looking for it, a joint Polish-Syrian team found something astonishing. Not too far from the modern city of Aleppo. Once again, history would be rewritten, pushing the dates back by thousands of years. For at Tel Karamel in modern-day Syria, the team found not just one similar tower to Jericho, but 5 of them, possibly dating to an astonishing 2,000 years earlier, perhaps as early as 10,000 BC, making the site roughly contemporary with the ritual centre at Göbekli Tepe. Is tower building a long-lost tradition that once held sway all over the region, only surviving now in 2 places? Why did Tel Karamel have an astonishing 5 towers rather than 1? Were they used for the same functions? And did more of them exist at other yet undiscovered or already demolished or built over sites? So far, as of 2019, only around 2% of Tel Karamel has been uncovered. Unfortunately, with the outbreak of war in 2007, excavations were put on a near-permanent suspension. Only the future can tell what other secrets lie hidden underneath the earth, just waiting to be rediscovered. A city is usually defined as a place containing both living quarters as well as religious and civic buildings. The tower at Jericho may have been both of the latter, sharing a religious as well as societal function by binding together the people of the region with a common cause. When first discovered, the tower had almost immediately been associated with the biblical story of Joshua, the early Israelite warlord said to have torn down the walls of the city using only trumpets and prayer, before launching, of course, into the customary sacking and mass death associated with that period of history. The tower is far too early to be connected in any way to the Bible, and interestingly seems even unconnected to the defensive works surrounding the Neolithic settlement, which do include a ditch and a wall. Yet these works themselves may have been built not as a defense against external enemies, but to defend against natural flash floods which regularly beset the region. If you live in a mud house, flooding and the natural world are as much your enemy as outsiders. Perhaps more so, especially during this time when settlements of Jericho's size were near unheard of. The similarly ancient city of Çatalhöyük, for example, in modern-day Turkey, which reached its height slightly later than Jericho, has rather unorthodox architecture, having no streets and the houses only being accessible via ladders onto the roofs. Settled life here may have begun in part to protect against the attacks of wild animals. The natural world was of course still at the forefront of life at these early settlements. Though some animals may have been on the road to domestication, the main source of meat still seems to have been wild gazelle. The people here were domesticating, but not on a huge scale yet, still living a mostly hunter-gatherer lifestyle from a sedentary position. The remains of gazelle, cattle, boar, sheep, and goat are found at Jericho, some of which may have been domesticated, though evidence is scarce, and it remains difficult to differentiate between wild and domesticated animals in the archaeological record. Maybe wild animals were being trapped and kept as food. A wild animal can be kept in a cage and fed before being eaten. It doesn't have to be domesticated. That takes a long time and many generations. The other major food source for these people was, of course, agricultural produce, including wheat, barley, peas, and beans, all of which had been gradually adapted from wild ancestors. The people at Jericho lived in round houses, around 14 feet in diameter, with sunken mud plaster floors. Each dwelling seems to have been pretty much identical, each with their own grain storage area, suggesting that every household had control of their own food, quite possibly being independent in terms of food production. This is very different to later Sumerian cities such as Uruk, where the priestly class held a deliberate monopoly over food production, and society itself was very socially stratified. Also, the houses at Jericho seem to be scattered at random throughout the site, each perhaps lived in by a distinct family or kinship group. Perhaps each of them descended from the tribes who had first come to the city to work together, all those centuries before. Rather than being grouped by profession and class like in later Sumerian cities, people seem to have been grouped around tribal houses, suggesting little social distinction and differentiation between the lowest and highest levels of society. It's thought by many scholars that Jericho began rather spontaneously with no central organisational structure, perhaps being built from the ground up by hunter-gatherer groups, rather than deliberately built by priest-kings like the later Sumerian cities. After all, writing, the key to Uruk's success, doesn't appear for some 4 or 5 millennia to come, and pottery even wasn't invented yet. Once thought to have been something of an anomaly, in recent years, other similar settlements have been discovered in the West Bank region, all sharing a similar culture, often called Natufian, with the only major difference between these sites being Jericho's massive size, sprawling over a 10-acre area. Could these be outlying settlements of Jericho, or simply related sites, separated only by geography, but linked up in a shared economic and cultural area? We know from archaeological finds that Jericho enjoyed widespread trade links with various other sites throughout the Fertile Crescent, with obsidian, an especially sharp volcanic rock from Asia Minor, useful to make sharp blades, being a particularly prized material. During this ancient time, Jericho was almost certainly the focal point of this entire region. Its oasis was simply far more abundant than its neighbours. Yet, with great prosperity, always comes a price. Pre-pottery Neolithic A Jericho lasted until somewhere around 7,300 to 7,000 BC, at which time the tell appears to have been abandoned. Much of the town wall collapsed and the top of the tower eroded away. We don't know what ended the first city at Jericho, and all manner of conclusions have been drawn from the evidence, Earthquake, pestilence, outside invasion, decline in soil fertility, or all of the above have been suggested as possible causes. Yet, within just a couple of lifetimes, in a situation that would eventually become endemic over the long eons, a new city would arise on top of the old. One of the most iconic finds at Jericho dates not to the pre-pottery Neolithic A period of the Watchtower, but to the next settlement to arise in the city's long history. A new culture that seems to have taken over the entire region, perhaps after a brief period of decline and abandonment. Whether the pre-pottery Neolithic B culture arose as the result of internal change or an external invasion, we can't be sure. But we know more about their material culture than their predecessors, for these were the adherents of the skull cult. Perhaps one of the earliest known examples of ancestor worship. Kathleen Kenyon, living through an age of war and chaos, saw the pre-pottery Neolithic B culture as a hostile, conquering people who drove out their predecessors through fire and bloodshed. Though in actuality this isn't at all clear, and could have been a natural progression from the previous people, perhaps after environmental devastation. We know that this new group were probably more populous than their predecessors, perhaps growing to a settlement of around 2,000 people, all defended by a new, substantial wall. The round houses of the previous city were replaced by rectangular, sometimes two-storied buildings, suggesting a definitive cultural shift. Like their predecessors, houses here were still made of mud brick, but were organised around rectangular courtyards, with gypsum floors and plastered walls often painted red with ochre. We know these dwellings were furnished with reed mats, and perhaps paintings, such as those at the contemporary city of Çatalhöyük, once adorned the walls, though evidence for this is scant. Though people still continued to hunt here, gazelles making up nearly half of the bones found in the archaeological record. Animals had definitely been domesticated too, with auroch, pigs and goats showing up in significant numbers. There is also evidence at other sites too of round houses being replaced by rectangular ones around this time, with a phase of fire destruction in between. Perhaps most notably at Beidha in modern-day Jordan, near the Nabatean city of Petra. Interestingly, 2 rooms were discovered here that may have been used for ceremonial purposes, along with 2 small figurines, thought by some to represent fertility deities. Also found throughout the region are animal and human-like figures, perhaps representing ancestors or spirits. Perhaps the most striking feature of pre-pottery Neolithic B Jericho, however, was the practice of plastering skulls, a tradition that seems to have been especially long-lasting and widespread. Upon death, the skull would be removed from the body, perhaps after being left outside to be picked clean by animals, or after a period on show for the community. It would then be filled with clay and external features moulded onto it with plaster, with shells often representing the eyes, and perhaps paint representing facial features. It seems that the body would then be buried underneath the household, with the skull seemingly left on display, though this is a matter of debate, with some seeming to be hidden away under the house. Evidence of similar practices has been found at neighbouring contemporary sites, such as Sheikh Ali, south of the Sea of Galilee, Tel Ramad near Damascus, Beida near Petra, and Çatalhöyük in Turkey. But what was the purpose of dressing skulls like this? A minority of scholars view these as trophies taken from defeated foes, akin to later headhunting traditions found as far afield as Polynesia and Celtic Europe. Others see them as talismans to ward off evil spirits or ghosts of the deceased. The most likely answer, however, is that they are an example of a religious tradition found all over the world throughout history, particularly in early farming communities, such as those later found in Britain during the Neolithic period. Veneration of the ancestors. Ancestor worship takes a wide range of different forms and is carried out for a number of different reasons. It demonstrated continuity between past and present generations, perhaps preserving the wisdom of the generations that came before. It may also have been an early form of property claim, with household ownership being demonstrated through ancestral display. They may also have been simply some of the earliest portraits in human history, looked on to remember dearly missed loved ones. The pre-pottery Neolithic B settlement at Jericho was an extremely long-lived society, probably existing in much the same state over a period of around 1,000 years. A span of time from the present back to the time of King Canute. Longer than the entire history of the Western Roman Empire. Yet nothing lasts forever, and just as Mesopotamia to the east saw the very first inklings of the greatness of Uruk to come, by around 6000 BC, a period of great decline in Palestine was about to set in. A catastrophe so devastating that some scholars see the region as remaining largely depopulated until the 5th millennium BC, well over 1,000 years later. Jericho would never be a regional centre again.